Today we have Sam Neuberg, who is discussing the evolution of 19th century fashion silhouette. So we're really lucky to have Sam here. He comes up to us from New York. He received his BA in Art History and Drama from McGill, which as we all know is Montreal, and his master's from the Fashion and Textile Studies program at FIT, which is also in Manhattan. He's an archival assistant for Women's Wear Daily, the PMC Media Corp in Manhattan, with a full range of experience in collections management and fashion archival consulting for private, corporate, and institutional clients. So today he's going to be illustrating pieces of clothing from our own collection.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Change of date. I'm happy to see that there's a good attendance. So my name is Samuel Neuberg, Sam, and we're going to talk about the evolution of the 19th century silhouette. So just a refresher. I'm coming from New York. I've worked for the last 6 years hands-on with historic costumes and textiles, both in museums and private collections, and to give you a proof that I know what I'm doing. Here's me handling a garment at the Met. No, when I was in grad school, I was fortunate enough to intern as a mannequin dresser at the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And, I think one of the really special things about looking at historic clothing is how much it tells you about the past. So that's kind of what we're going to do today. We're going to try and understand the past by looking at the clothing that we have from those time periods. So I thought that to start, it would be good to kind of do a brief overview of 100 years, which is a long amount of time. And in the 19th century, a lot happens in 100 years. But throughout the lecture, I do have composites, kind of these timelines, so we can have a visual idea of how the silhouettes change. I want to do a bit of an overview of the 100 years of fashion history, and then I want to move to the objects in particular from the museum's collection, so we can kind of frame those back into the general overview of time in the 19th century. I wanted to start with this quote, because even though I think that the 19th century seems further and further away from us today, it's a pretty impactful period of time that still affects us. So here, I can read this out loud. To understand contemporary dress, we must study the 19th century, the century that puts to the fore the individual and the anonymous crowd, dandyism and uniformity, distinctiveness and conformism. It is particularly important to examine the Second Empire, this crucial period of technical, industrial, and commercial innovation that broke with clothing's ancient regime, in fact, as well as principle, and that it did so in a general fashion rather than just sporadically. The rapid growth of the textile industry, the sizable development of the ready-made industry, the unprecedented impact of the department stores that distributed the product of that industry, the parallel decline of the centuries-old trade in used clothes, and the improvements in living standards made possible the process that eventually made everyone look like a bourgeois, Philippe Perrault fashioning the bourgeoisie. So in a nutshell, that kind of encompasses some of the major things that changed this century. If you think about the 1790s, and in America, the 1790s, we're not really doing very much here other than stabilizing after the revolution, but revolution is happening throughout the Western world in the end of the 1700s. In France, you have a major upheaval. In America, you have calming down after the revolution. After the dust settles from that, a lot of stuff begins to happen in fashion because outside of the politics, technology at the turn of the 19th century really begins to make things possible for fashion that weren't possible the previous century. At the end of the 1790s, you have a lot of dress inspired by kind of more of a classical style. I thought that maybe looking at the 1800s to the 1830s was a good way to understand this brief period, because although we often apply the term Victorian to the 19th century, the truth is that Queen Victoria doesn't become queen until 1837. So we have a 30-year time period in which she's not the one setting the standard for dress. During the French Revolution, the fashion press industry that was published in France was cut off. So the rest of Europe was effectively kind of locked out of communication from what was happening in fashion in France. At the end of the revolution, the fashion press is reactivated, and France begins publishing plates and fashion illustrations that begin telling Europe kind of what to look like. Before the revolution, France had been the center of fashionable taste and style, and the revolution, I think, is understandable, cut things off. But at the end, France is very eager to economically restabilize itself with the sale of its silks and textiles, and also sartorially go back to being the center of style. I really like this illustration, though, because I think it shows what a huge contrast there is between the years before the 1790s and really where fashion begins to go at the end of the 18th century, leading into the 19th. So already by the 1790s, you have what we would call maybe more of a classically inspired silhouette. If you have these giant panniers, hoop on the side of the dress to make the silhouette of the 1770s and the 1780s possible. By the 1790s, women have begun to favor these more columnar, simpler dresses. Simpler in that they don't require as much structure projecting around them, but they are still, you know, worn with a light corset underneath, something to bind the body. Moving into the early years of the 1800s, that's pretty much the same. So as you can see here, we have a fashion plate from 1797 from Heidelhoff's Gallery of Fashion, which is one of the earliest surviving full fashion books that we have from before the Revolution. Then on the other side, we have a plate for afternoon dress from 1800. Just taking a quick look at these two images, though some of the trimmings and the feathers and the things that make the image on the right seem a little bit more done up, can you kind of see the way that these two are very similar to one another? Even though the hats have changed, the feathers, the trimmings are gone away, women at the beginning of the century are still dressing very much in this neoclassically inspired silhouette. So at the beginning of the century, you still have women wearing very light white dresses, much more in a Greco-Roman style. Around 1800, the Jacquard Loom is fully figured out. Jacquard was a French inventor who created a system for weaving in which you could create complex weaves using a mechanized process rather than having people manipulate all of the draw looms. So I think that's very significant to think about, because if in 1800 women are still favoring simple white non-decorated textiles, at the start of the century the most complex machine for creating complicated textiles is also invented. So moving on through the century, we're going to see that fashion gets much more complicated as the industrial technology to produce more complicated textiles develops as well. So it's not very surprising that the beginning of the century is kind of blank. And just because these dresses are white does not mean they're not decorated, but usually the detailing that goes on is not as complicated as we'll see moving through the century. And like I said, just because things were Grecianly inspired did not mean that they were not heavily structured. So here we have an illustration of a woman getting dressed, getting helped to be dressed. So you see she has a chemise or an undergarment that she wears a corset over. And this over here from the Kyoto Costume Institute in Japan is actually an example of one style of corset. So you can see that if you're familiar with the stays of Marie Antoinette, kind of a full-bodied corset, something like this is rather a departure because it's more of a wraparound. But I think the thing to think about with this century is how much the overall shape changes, and those shapes don't happen on the outside, they're formed from the inside. So looking at a corset like this, you can see how the effect really is to minimize the bosom and cinch in the high waist, which works really well for an umpire-style waistline. So at the beginning of the century, the waist is also about up here, which is not natural. We're going to see over the century that the line drops down again, but the shape of that waist is not natural either. I think this is also a really good point to make the mention that when we're talking about the fashionable body across time, we're talking about a fashionable ideal. I don't think I have to explain that even today. We have a standard for what we think fashion looks like, and then the way that we each try and achieve it in our own lives. So it's very similar with the 19th century. A fashion plate where a woman's neck is this long and her head is this big, it's not realistic, and women did not look like that, but they used much more control through their undergarments to make their bodies conform to that ideal than I think we do today. Or maybe cosmetic surgery is a new form of that, I'm not sure. So I like to start with this kind of a timeline because you can see that this is 1796. I'm sorry if these dates aren't super visible, but we start in 1796 and we end in 1827, and what you can kind of see is that overall the general shape is not really that different. Even though you're going to get all these different changes in decoration and trim, the neoclassically inspired tube of the beginning of the century really stays in place up until, 20 years in. One thing that is very different is that if the beginning of the century starts with a neoclassical or a Greco-Roman inspiration for its fashion, midway through the beginning of the 1810s, there's a shift more towards Romanticism and the revival of romantic ideals, especially in England, where the Gothic style gets heavily revived. But another thing that's very important, and it's going to keep coming up in the 19th century, is the concept of revivalism. If you think about how we seem to keep bringing back the 60s and the 70s every season, It's no different than the 19th century going, wasn't the Renaissance so beautiful? Don't you think a troubadour sleeve here would look so nice? And so I think an interesting thing to think about with revivalism in the 19th century is that it's not entirely a copycat of what was done in the past. The past serves as an inspiration for silhouettes and proportions that the 19th century adopts and turns into their own thing. And when we look at these garments from the outside, it might easily be a mistake of the eye to think that a detail on a 19th century garment that also looks similar to a 16th century garment is just a coincidence. That's where you begin to understand that in the 19th century, they're looking back to the fashionable past and pulling things into their silhouettes, modifying them a little bit though, because it wouldn't look super fashionable in the current moment to wear what somebody wore 300 years ago. I think that's the same thing today too, although we don't go as far back with our style. We pull from, the last 20 years rather than the last 200. So I think one thing that really signifies a development in style in the beginning of this period before Victoria takes the throne is the fact that we start with more of a Greco-Roman neoclassical silhouette, and then the inspiration for revivalism doesn't just focus on that one particular culture. We kind of begin looking all over the past and pulling that into dress. France really does remain, after the Revolution, the center of women's fashion culture, and in contrast, it's in England that men's fashion really begins to announce itself in this time period. This is a great example, and the muff has shown up. I wanted to try and pull some things that were winter related as the snow is approaching, but you can see that this is from 1810, and really, still nothing has really changed. The waist is up here as it might have been in the late 1790s. This is a beautiful red wool, this is all fur, but all of the textiles, all of the materials of the previous century are still really being used. There's nothing new, right? Now we have all these new smart fabrics. That's really a development that doesn't happen until later in the century. So the silhouette doesn't really change, it kind of just develops in the beginning. I wanted to show this example of men's and women's because I think what you can see is that, sorry, I keep forgetting. For men's and women's, you can kind of see the silhouette is similar, but it's adapted very differently. Obviously, men and women have different proportions, but at the beginning of the 19th century, there's as much focus for men to constrict their waists and do an hourglass silhouette as there is for women. And that really does change. Think about before the Revolution. Men and women are wearing very elaborate, very colorful, very expensive clothing. After the Revolution, fashion for women continues in that vein, but for men, there's a turn more towards more somberness in the silhouette. So at the beginning of the century, so for menswear, one thing that is very significant and almost radical is that this is when we begin wearing pants. Prior to the 1800s, men really wore breeches and pantaloons. It was in France during the Revolution that wearing culottes or pants versus breeches was a distinction of political markering of what side you were on. If you were going to wear knee breeches, you were kind of assigning yourself to be part of the aristocracy, whereas if you were sans culotte, you might be a radical who is in the favor of the revolution. After the revolution ends, partially because there's not a desire to realign people culturally with the ills of the ancient regime, the aristocracy, and partially because tastes change. With the revolution ending, a younger generation of people come up as the leaders in French society, and they're wearing buckskin trousers. They're not wearing breeches. So that really sets a standard, but it's in England that menswear really gets tightened up. The idea of a dandy develops in the beginning of the 19th century. One of the most famous dandies, Beau Brummell, is from England, and really what Beau Brummell does is he's known not for how ostentatious and elaborate and how colorful he dresses, but because of how he uses somber, dark colors subtly and pairs them so well. He creates a new standard for men's dressing that starts in England and spreads everywhere. Actually, if you read the works of not the works of Baudelaire, if you read his journals, you hear him talking about how he has to buy new waistcoats and tailcoats so he can look like all of these men in England. One thing that I think is really cool, though, is that you see what starts to happen throughout the first 20, 30 years of the time period is that if it starts as a tube, it begins to graduate in shape. It's not as though there wasn't fullness in dress before the 19th century, and so I think what begins to happen is just like when a new trend is introduced and people really like it, and then they kind of are like, okay, but what were we wearing before this trend came out? I think that's one of the ways that we can think about how the shape of the skirt and the shape of the body begins to accentuate and graduate in size, moving into the early Victorian period. You can see how a dress like this, even though it's high at the waist, it has a fullness to it where the skirt kind of moves out. So if this dress is from 1820 and this dress right here is from the 1850s, you can see there's a significant difference in proportion. And I want to just mention that, you know, when you look at a dress like this, you're not really looking at a dress that's made in a construction pattern like this, where you have cartridge pleats at the waist that open up the skirt. A dress like this is made of panels, angled panels that are sewn together to kind of create a cone shape. When you have a cone like that, you can't really get very, very big. So the silhouette is still controlled, but it's beginning to get a little bit wider. You can see it starts small up here and begins expanding towards the bottom. So if you keep your eye on the hemline of these early 18th century garments, you get to get a sense of where the shape is about to go. Again, women are wearing corsets. In fact, as we move deeper into the 1800s, the underwear and the understructures begin getting more complex again, because that Greco-Roman fad, if you want to call it, doesn't last forever. And these chemise dresses that women were wearing at the beginning of the century, these very clear, white, sheer Greco-Roman style garments, didn't require a lot of underwear. But as that fad fades out and Romanticism and revivalism from different centuries comes in, fabric needs a bit more support. So you can also see that the underwear gets a bit more complicated to make these dresses work. By 1822, you really can see that we're getting more of a cone shape in the structure. Even though the waist is still very high, what's happening is that by making the waist here and then creating angled panels from that waist, you're beginning to build a cone that will just get bigger and bigger as the century moves. So moving deeper into the 1800s, you see a move away from just muslin and linen and gauze. Heavier fabrics begin to become popular again. It's the beginning of the 1800s also. We associate this again with the Victorians, but it starts prior to Victoria. The Victorians were all about appropriateness of dress, right? Day dress, evening dress, afternoon dress. That actually begins happening before the Victorians. If you'd like to think about rejecting all of the rules of revolutionary society, you have to create a new way of making people follow social customs. So it's the 19th century that sees kind of the development of dress and social order be tied together. I wanted to show an example of moving towards the 1830s, how the silhouette changes both from the outside to really look much more like a bell. You kind of see how things are getting wider and almost like this, but really not as wide. It's all controlled from the underside. So here you'd have a bodice and a corset worn over a chemise. These are sleeve puffs. They actually keep the sleeve inflated, so to speak. And you know, this is all necessary to make this happen on the other side. It's funny to us, I think we look at this and it seems complicated and very cumbersome, but you have to remember that this is normal to everyone getting dressed in the morning in the 1830s, and this is what they want to look like. And so if this is the goal, that's how it's achieved. Can you already see, though, how this is significantly more complicated than 30 years ago, at the beginning of the century, when all you needed was a wrap top bandeau and you were ready to go? So by the 1830s, you can already begin to see a bit of the silhouette that looks more familiar to us as a Victorian silhouette. If sleeves of the 1800s, the early 1800s, were small and tight at the top of the body, they gain more volume, they get puffier. You're going to watch the sleeve go from the shoulder to the elbow to the wrist over the course of the century, and you can already begin to see it make its journey by the fullness that it takes at the shoulder in this time period. I also want to say, menswear really kind of gets locked in place once the early 18th century silhouette is developed. Though the cut of the coat, the length of the tails, the size of the lapel might fluctuate over time, once men adopt a three-piece suit cut in wool at the beginning of the century, it doesn't change very much. So that's not to ignore menswear, it's just to say that women's wear during the 19th century changes and accelerates at a much greater pace. I said at the beginning that there were all these technological innovations that made new fabrics possible. Well, what do you do with those fabrics? You sell them. So the 19th century really sees the development of a commercial market for clothing culture in a way that didn't really exist prior. In France, for example, prior to the Revolution, there was an entire hierarchy of secondhand clothing sellers. So if you were at the top of the social order and you didn't need your clothing anymore, you would sell it to a vendor who would then sell your finest court gown to someone the rung below you. And all of French society, and to that extent English and other parts of Europe, functioned the same way. Clothing was reused and recycled. At the beginning of the 19th century, you have technological innovations that produce more fabric than ever before. You have colonies all over Europe, North America, other parts of the world that Europe needs to clothe. And so you really have the development of a clothing economy that didn't exist the previous century, and you have people who now have more money to consume textiles and wear them. And since menswear doesn't really change, it's in women's wear that we see clothing and textiles really accelerate and change quite regularly. I will say, prior to the 19th century, there already was an idea of seasonal fabrics. The French kind of invented that in their production of textiles to get people shopping for textiles regularly. First of all, I also think everyone in Vermont will understand there's a difference between wearing a nice linen dress in the summer and wearing that in the winter. So the idea of seasonal textiles and seasonal fabrics had developed before the 18th century, the 19th century, going back to the 18th. But it's in the 19th century that this concept of seasonal textiles and then the production of textiles gets married together so you can produce more textiles per season to sell. So I think that's something that we're still kind of locked into, and it really develops in the 19th century. I chose this image just because this is kind of the idea of where we go from the 1830s moving to the middle of the century. The hoop skirt doesn't just happen, but I think this is an image that we most associate with the Second Empire or the Civil War. And I don't want to ignore American fashion. I will just say that American fashion is connected to the fashion trends developed by Europe. So we do always want to be looking back to Europe because we're just importing fashion from Europe up until maybe still now. So that's another conversation. But now in the 1830s, it's an important period because in 1837, Queen Victoria is coronated. And she will reign for a very long time. And even though we call all of the clothing developments under her Victorian, the reason we do that is because of how long she was on the throne. By taking the throne in 1837 and not removing herself from that seat until 1901, she really is a figurehead for a lot of the change that happens during that time period. And as a woman, she also is a living fashion plate for many people. So I think keeping your eye on Queen Victoria is something that helps you understand how dress changes because everything that she's wearing is really the height of fashion. So as she wears it, it gets adopted everywhere else. Or what she does has a big impact. Case in point, the white wedding dress there's a myth. So this is, first of all, this is her getting coronated. This is the coronation gown from Kensington Palace. You can kind of see that there's a lot of similarity from this gown from 1837 to the gown from 1850 right here. We've already moved in the 1830s kind of into a different shape for clothing. If at the start of the century, women were stepping into a single dress, like an empire-style waist that closed in the back, think about it. A garment composed of a bodice and a skirt is not a new invention. That was a way that women were dressing prior to the start of the 18th century. The 19th century. So if you think about, again, this Greco-Roman tubular trend as a trend, when that ended, there was still a format for dressing like this to go back to. So we see in Queen Victoria's coronation gown that by the 1830s, the late 1830s, most women are going back to two pieces of clothing to have a full outfit, a full skirt as well as a bodice. Queen Victoria is also very significant because of her wedding gown. There's lots of different stories about how wedding gowns became white. Queen Victoria, as far as we have documentation, is the first person to have a public wedding in a white wedding gown in the 19th century. And after that, it became a trend throughout England and Europe, so much so that her own daughters would be married in white. It's just one of those things that it builds a lot of myth around it. The idea of purity and virginal ideals is something that's very Victorian. It gets tied to the color of white. But I think we should look at Queen Victoria as a trendsetter, really, because this was a very important event, the wedding, and her entire reign. Prior to, I guess, Victoria, it wasn't as possible to photograph your ruler doing everything, and so her image is so disseminated that it really does create standards for dress. So again, this is 1828 at the top, and then by the end we're in 1848. And I think you can see that we really go from a cone, if we were at a cone prior to 1828, the cone is turning into a bell. Think of the 19th century as a shifting of shapes. The shape is evolving. If it started like this, it turned into that, and then we're getting to here. And can you kind of see how that's happening? The cone still exists, but instead of the waist being here, it's jumped down. Once the waist moves from your sternum to your actual natural waist, you have a lot more room to play with. We begin to see the expansion of the silhouette of a skirt through the 1830s and 1840s because we're no longer anchoring the waist of women's gowns right at their sternum. In doing that, you also have to construct a skirt out of different patterns. So rather than these triangular gores creating a cone, you actually begin to get a technique like cartridge pleating. Cartridge pleating is very significant to the 1840s because it allows the skirt to get a lot fuller. A cartridge pleat essentially is a row of pleating, like a skirt. You pleat a skirt together around the waistband, and then you fold it over at the waistband, and that fold on those pleats creates almost like a spring effect. So everything that's, if you can kind of see right here, you know, this is all pleating set in at the waist that's been folded over. It's that fold that creates a bit of a spring for expansion of the silhouette. That is not enough to keep the skirt out, but if you think about the skirt being the top layer of all of that understructure, it's going to create that shape once it's put on top of everything. So if we look at the mid-1830s, early 1840s as the period in which skirts switched from being triangular panels sewn together at the sternum to being kind of like 6 or 7 or 8 pieces of fabric pleated and sewn around a waistband lower down, just think about how more fabric means more shape. Not only is it more shape so we can make things look bigger, it's also tied back into consumption. I just mentioned earlier that there's more fabric being produced than ever before. That means there's more of a need to push people to buy fabric. Where are they buying it from? It's the early 1840s that we begin to see the emergence of dry goods vendors, specialized merchants. Over the 1850s and 1860s, those turned into department stores. So there's a culture for consuming fabric that becomes socially normalized, right? The department store becomes a normalized experience, and women become consumers of their own textiles. So as they're buying more and as their ability to buy more happens, the shape of the dresses that they make out of the fabric they buy gets bigger in response, right? We look at the Victorian period as the growth and development of a middle class, of the development of stable economies from major parts of the westernized world. And in those normalized and stabilized places, it's easier to consume clothing culture. So now this is a dress from 1840 to 1845 from the Met. This is an American dress. It's made out of cotton. It's plaid. I think it's great for Vermont. It might be warm on a day like today. But just look at this dress and see what's happened from the dresses that we were looking at earlier from the 1820s. It's so funny because it's very different and yet entirely the same. The shape that used to be right here and very, very tight has now graduated to lower down on the body. And in moving further down, everything's kind of opened up. Even though the waist still seems very, very controlled, by taking that line and dropping it, you're actually expanding the silhouette. The torso gets longer, the waist gets smaller because the hips get wider, but everything is very controlled. Remember I told you in the 1820s and the 1830s to look at the sleeves? When they were up at the shoulder, they were very big and they were very puffy. That's a lot of work, and women don't want to wear a giant goose feather thing on their arm for 15 years. What you see is the fullness graduates down so that by the 1840s you begin getting very full sleeves. The volume from the shoulder has gone to the middle of the arm. Sometimes you find that the wrist gets very tight, so you get a nice balloon sleeve, but it's definitely during the 1840s, 1850s that we see sleeves inflate. By the 1850s you have something known as a pagoda sleeve, which is just a giant sleeve, usually kind of like an over sleeve that another sleeve could go under. Keep that in mind because that sleeve comes back. Even by the end of the century, trends that happened in the middle of the century get revived. So this is a dress from 1845 from the Kyoto Costume Institute. I think this is a pretty good example of seeing how by the mid-1840s, we're in a totally different place than we were in 1800. One thing that fascinates me personally is to think that that's only 45 years. So there are people who are alive who are experiencing these changes that are normal to them. In the way that if you ratted your hair in the 60s and don't anymore, that seems normal, but to me, that seems crazy. But it's just funny to think that one woman living through this century actually experiences all of these silhouette changes. And by the 1840s, we're in a very different place than we are from the start of the century. It's very interesting to think about the 19th century as being both totally different than what came before it and also being rooted in the previous century, because all of the techniques necessary for constructing bodices like this really come out of the 18th century, but they're readjusted for the needs of the 19th century. This is not a Marie Antoinette style dress, is what I'm trying to say, but a lot of the techniques for tailoring and construction are not divorced from the techniques that came from the century beforehand. It's just a change in the way that hand is applied. This is another mid-century piece. Again, I thought this would be good for us approaching storm. But again, in the 1840s, you really see how the fullness has expanded because the line of the waist has shifted from the bust to kind of more of a natural point. In doing so, everything else gets bigger as well. So moving from 1840 to 1860, you can see that things really do get quite large. As skirts become bigger, or as the fabric for skirts becomes larger, there's a need to make these shapes really work. So how do you make a skirt this big? Any ideas? How do you make a skirt this big from underneath?
Crinoline.
Right, and crinoline is a complicated word because there's more than just one. So the first stage of development in the crinoline, first I guess I should say, we all know that it's not like there's only one layer of underwear underneath Victorian clothing. There's many, many layers of undergarments and underskirts. To get these fuller shapes of the 1840s, women would wear layers and layers and layers of petticoats. Some of these petticoats would be reinforced with crin, which is French for horsehair, and that's how we get the word crinoline, because you get a crinoline skirt around your garment. Women would edge the hems of these skirts in horsehair to give a stiffness to the skirt to help with projecting it out. But if you need to keep up with these changes every couple of months as the skirt gets wider and wider, do you know what that means? That means more and more and more layers of petticoats. So by the mid-1840s, you have women walking around, hardly able to breathe, because they're wearing 7, 10 layers of skirts just to get that shape. It's fashion, you're supposed to suffer for beauty, but it's very, very difficult. So outside of developments in textiles, there's technological developments in steel in the 1850s that transform fashion. First, let me give you some examples of dress. Prior to a cage crinoline, which is a steel hoop skirt, you have dresses that are full but not gigantic. So I think this is a good example of an 1850s silhouette that has volume to it but hasn't yet exploded, as we will in the 1860s. I go back to Victoria because by this point she's already had a couple kids, and I think that we should look at the Victorian family through Victoria's family because you really get a good sense of propriety in Victorian dress. Like I said, it was the Victorians who created a new social culture out of dress culture in this period. So the Victorians are the people who invent day dress, morning dress, day dress, walking dress, traveling costume. All of these are to describe how you should be dressed when you interact with other people in these social situations. And Victoria and her family, I think, are a really good example of that because of how many children she has and how many ages those children span. You can really see them as tent poles for the fashion trends that move throughout the period. But even look at her youngest daughter, or one of her younger daughters. She's in a full skirt. So we can see trends develop through this family. Moving into 1858, 1860, we're already getting to a much fuller skirt. So you really can see that once petticoats and crinolines begin getting added under skirts, it just gets bigger. It doesn't get smaller for a while. I just want to show you what I was talking about. This is the outward silhouette, and this is the under to make it happen. That's a lot, right? That's very cumbersome. So, and then this is an actual petticoat. So think about, you have all of your skirts, and then you need a top skirt that's still underwear, but it's nice enough that if the flash of it showed when you were walking, it's the appropriate petticoat to show. So there's a lot of propriety that goes into this, but it's a lot of work. So by the mid-1850s, we have the development of mass-produced steel to create what's called a cage crinoline. Well, I'll get to the optics in a minute. There's a couple cage crinolines on the table, but as you can see, the benefit of a cage crinoline is that you still need to wear a petticoat or a skirt underneath as an underwear base, but you can attach this to the waist, and then you have a lightweight steel structure that provides the silhouette for you. So that really reduces the need to wear all of these layers of petticoats, which in one way is a great thing. Hoop skirts, cage crinolines, brought their own form of trouble. It made skirts far more flammable. They would trap air and they would catch fire if you stood by the flame. So women sometimes burst into flame. They stood too close to things. Just think about it, the skirt becomes an incubator for air and all of that stuff. They become heavily satirized because they get bigger and bigger. I want to point out though, and so I think by 1856, 1859, you can already see that with a steel skirt, you're able to bear far more weight than a petticoat alone, and you really can just get bigger and bigger. But I want to maintain that, it's not as though there was one style of hoop skirt and it changed every season, everyone had the same one. When we see styles like this, not everyone was dressing this way. So think about the top of a trend and then the way that it trickles down, and understand that even with hoop skirts, not everyone was walking around with a giant cage lashed around them, because some people thought that that was unfashionable or unbecoming. And so I think another way to think about nuance in the 19th century is that as these things are developing, certain people adopt them and others don't. And I think Vermont is a good example of that because I think we can understand the divide between town and farm. And there are some people who never need to get this dressed up, and there are other people who really care to. And so a cage crinoline like this allows that silhouette to be possible. What we start to see also in the 1860s is that if the skirts started as big bells, as they get wider and wider, it really creates a problem. I mean, imagine 35 women like this, or with larger skirts, trying to sit in this room for a lecture. That's very, very difficult. What we see in the 1860s is that the volume, instead of being full around the body, starts getting tighter and pulled to the back. So that by the mid-1860s, you start to have almost like a bump, a circle that's kind of curved into a bump. And that's how we get the bustle of the 1870s and the 1880s. So see, there's a lot of fullness. Either this can keep going to the point where everyone's just a giant circle, which doesn't really work, or the fullness can get reined in. And so in pulling in the fullness, that's how we get to the bustle. You can see that the fullness goes from being a circle to being pulled towards the back, and then eventually it just becomes a matter of why not just pull it all up? And that's really where we get the bustle from. It's an evolution of the hoop skirt into a more controlled silhouette. I also want to mention a very important thing happens in 1868, and that's the founding of the Chambre syndicale de haute couture, which is the foundation of the couture economy. And we have Charles Frederick Worth to thank for that. Charles Frederick Worth was a British designer working in Paris, and he was the first person to open up a custom dress shop where he would ready make gowns for clients. And his first client was his first clients were among members of the Second Empire political system. So you have Napoleon's, you have Empress Eugenie buying, Empress Eugenie is buying clothing from Charles Frederick Worth. She's his first client. And after that, he's the first couturier. So we have couture developing in this time period. I think it's important to understand that couture develops because at the same time, you have the expansion of a department store system beginning to sell clothing to people in more of a mass-produced method. You have a dress shop or a dressmaker inside of the department store that will make things for you, help you with things. There will always be people who want better for more. And so the couture system develops really as a way of creating the finest level of quality for clothing, aside from ready-made clothing that are developing in other parts of the market. So again, this is a cage crinoline from the 1870s. Can you see how this is related to the hoop skirt of the 1850s, but it's just shifted? So the shape really does change. This is how you begin to get these dresses with bustles in the back. All of the volume just gets pulled to the back of the garment. The bustle is a very interesting thing because the bustle goes through two phases. The bustle has a initial popularity surge in the 1870s and then kind of goes away for a couple years to make way for the princess line seam, which is a revolutionary seam at the time because it's the first way of creating like a body-conscious garment without creating like heavily intricate tailoring for a garment. A princess line seam is kind of just two lines that run down the front and the back of a garment that taper everything in. With the princess line focus on streamlining the body, the bustle kind of is less important until the princess line is integrated with the bustle and the bustle comes back in the 1880s much bigger. So I like to show a variety of bustles in the same way that I like to show a variety of hoop skirts to understand that there's not just one, and there's many different ways that they can be worn for many different purposes. And there are even bustles that you could adjust the volume of while you were wearing them if you needed to be bigger or smaller depending on where you were going. So by the late 1870s, the bustle's huge, right? It's really like a tea tray. But like I said, the 1880s, initially we see a dip down in the bustle because of this idea of the princess line. This isn't a perfect example of a princess line, but what you can see is that interest in the fullness of the back is diverted into streamlining the torso in the front. So steel is not only used to create hoop skirts and bustles, it's also used to create corsets that hitherto had been structured with baleen or wood. Now sprung steel can be put into a corset to make it both durable and strong and more lightweight, easier to wear. So you really see the effect that it has on the waist of the 1880s. Once steel begins getting into corsetry, it's much easier to make lightweight, heavily strong garments that can really girder somebody in. And that's where the focus goes at the beginning of the 1880s. I mean, really pull people in. This is really where we get more of an hourglass shape. This looks like an hourglass as well, but this is where the torso really turns into an hourglass. This is known as the cuirasse silhouette. And you can really see that tight waist influenced by the princess line, combined with the revival of the second bustle craze in the 1880s, creates almost like a snail. That's one of the caricatures that women were often depicted as in the 1880s, as having these tiny little waists and big backs like they were snails walking around London, or something like that. I think it's a very seductive silhouette, but it is not where the century started. So once the bustle comes back, you really see it remain in favor until the end of the 1800s, the 1880s, I should say, and then at the beginning of the 1890s, the bustle shifts down again. Instead, the focus goes back to a very tight waist and a very full skirt. So moving to the end of the century, we go away from this tight hourglass with the big back to really a very controlled waist and a very curved, full skirt, almost like a trumpet. It's at the end of the 19th century that we begin to see the development of an S-curve. The S-curve is something very significant to the Belle Epoque and the Edwardian period, where women are literally hunched like this. That's because the curvature that had been on the back of the garment moves to the front with the corset. Another thing that makes the end of the 19th century, the 1890s, very significant is that women gain more access to independence. I should say they're moving towards it. Athleticism and leisure pursuits for the upper class become very popular, and so women need garments that allow them to do that. Bicycling, for example, becomes a very active health sport at the end of the 1890s, and so this cartoon here says, "My dear Jessie, what on earth is that bicycle suit for?" Jessie, "Why to wear, of course." Gertrude, "But you haven't got a bicycle." Jessie, "No, but I've got a sewing machine." And I think that's great because it shows you that both the desire for a trend and the adoption of a trend are not reliant on actually doing the thing itself. It's more that fashion moves with these social markers. And so the sewing machine had been on the market since the 1840s. That's another thing that allows women to be creating their own wardrobes. She doesn't need to have a bicycle to look like she has one. And I think that is something that people still do today. They want to look the part. But you know, this is another example on the other side of how people really hated these shapes in dress. So remember how I talked about the sleeve coming back? These big puffy sleeves of the 1820s and 30s. They come back in the 1890s as what's kind of called a Lego mutton sleeve because they look like a leg of lamb, you know? But caricaturists of the time really enjoyed making fun of them. Let's see, a racket sleeve, a gun sleeve, a balloon sleeve, you know? These are all sartorial satirist comments on the way that women dress. It's tricky because I think by the end of the 1890s, it begins to look very much like the early 1900s, and it's not surprising, is it, that the end of one century looks very similar to the start of the next century, in the same way that the start of this century looked very similar to the start of the century before it. So the 1900s, the early 1900s, in many ways, are a continuation of the late 1890s. And by the late 1890s, we already have a shift in dress. I think one of the big shifts in dress in the 1890s is the idea of a shirtwaist. The shirtwaist is a blouse that you can wear with a skirt. It's kind of the idea of separates dressing, that you could create an ensemble without having to have a full garment. That is very liberating for women. It means that there's not an adherence to one kind of way of looking during the day. Also, because of the need to wear things that allow you to move, she's playing golf in this display. Dresses like this really are not appropriate. Even the dresses that we saw from the late 1870s are not appropriate. So the development of a shirtwaist is something that kind of liberates women from having to wear a full ensemble all the time. That might not sound like a big deal, but conceptually, ideologically, socially, that gets people closer to thinking about not needing to be a doll all the time in what they wear. And you know, we see this in art as well. We really see this change in dress by the end of the 1890s. That gets us very close to the 1900s. And then by the 1900s, it's really only 17 years until the war. So I promised myself I wouldn't go into the 1900s, I want to stay in the 1800s. But by the end of the 1890s, we really see a silhouette that looks very proto-Edwardian. And that's because the development of those trends is starting in the end of this century. We have these two dressed mannequins. I wanted to show everyone an example kind of a very full silhouette from the 1850s, and then a full silhouette too from another time period, but one that's kind of different. We're going to wear some gloves just to handle these objects, but I wanted to give everyone an example, an opportunity to see some examples of these objects. Vanessa, will you open, or when you get these gloves on, will you hold up this skirt, this petty? Yeah. How about that? So Not so bad for an old gal, hey? So this might look really crazy to us today, but can you imagine how much easier this makes your life rather than wearing 7 to 12 skirts in a day? I think the idea of something like this too, thank you, you can put it down, is that this is not the hoop skirt you wear to go dancing at the ball. This is maybe the hoop skirt you wear to go send your letter to the post. You might have more than one, and you don't wear the same one all the time.
Question?
Yes.
Was that person very, very tiny, or would that just not need to go all the way to the ground?
Mix. So this person probably was the proportion for that to work, but the skirt, a hoop wouldn't necessarily need to go all the way to the floor. You'd be wearing skirting with it that would finish the job up, basically. Yeah. So then that's another example of kind of a smaller silhouette that you could achieve. You know, as you can see, even this one is smaller than the first one that Vanessa held up. And what that turns into is something like this, which is a bustled crinoline. Sorry, can I pass it to you and I'll move? It's a bustled crinoline of the 1870s. And you can really see how the structure of this, just from a production perspective, is really rooted in the full hoop skirt of the 1850s. But as the shape of the 1870s happens, it doesn't need that much fullness in the front. Fullness gets sent to the back. And one of the things I think is really cool about this, is can everyone see that there's this wire right here, back here? There's this lacing. That's what allows the wearer, can you hold it from the waist, sorry? The waist. That allows the wearer to constrict the shape of her bustle to be wider or smaller depending on how she needs it to fit for her. You can also see that this is a kind of complicated garment. You know, you don't have to touch the back of it. It's much more controlled than a hoop skirt of the 1850s. So these things might look like they're totally different objects, but this is actually just the evolution of this into that. Yes?
I'm curious about mobility. I mean, even before the car, but the things changing and public transportation.
Right.
How sitting down?
So it's doable to sit in this, but it's not as easy for a woman to sit in this as it is. You know, with a hoop, you have to think a lot more about what you're going to do before you do it. And one of the things but to answer the question, another thing I would ask you all to think about is 19th century biases about women based on how they moved. You know, they're demure, they're feeble. Is it true that they really were, or that they were wearing this and they can't run after you? They dropped a book and they can't bend over. If you bend over in this, the whole skirt goes with you. So you don't bend over. You curtsy to pick up your handkerchief. Your waist is tight. You know, so all of the understructure that creates the outer edifice, we today might think of as limiting. To women at the time, there were things that were helping them achieve their silhouette, but they definitely are not easy. They're definitely not easy. It's funny though, someone wearing this might think that she's having an easier time than she was 3 years ago when she had to wear all the petticoats. But this is another thing to think about. Not every woman's wearing these. And you might not wear this if you're getting on the train to go to Woodstock. You might wear something that's a little bit smaller. And as these shapes shift and as the garments that hold everything in place get smaller, it does become easier to get around. Something like a bustle like this is only the back of your skirt. So you're walking around. When you sit down, this collapses with you. There are other bustles that are just armatures at the back of the body that literally collapse when you sit. I've seen I've seen illustrations. They're ads and Godey's and Ladies' Home Journal from the period for bustles that had extensions to turn into seats so that you could have legs drop down and sit if you're at the museum. So they actually provided their own form of structure. It really just depends. And think about also a marketplace. You know, you don't have just one bustle manufacturer, you have many, and hoop skirt manufacturer. So you actually get to see a whole range of different kinds of garments. They're variations on the theme, you know? And there are some women who want a net bustle. There are some women who want a seat bustle. And so you have to begin thinking about how all of these fashion trends are tied to manufacturing and advertising too, because you have all these different forms of clients to sell to. So all of that kind of happens in the 19th century also. This is an example of an earlier corset, something from the beginning of the century. And even though that silhouette of a columnar ancient Grecian goddess that was very popular at the start of the century seems very simple, this is a pretty heavy piece of underwear, if you think about it. And so the beginning of the century sees underwear and corsetry that's focused on controlling the shape of that tubular silhouette. This isn't so boned, this is more about holding everything in. But remember, stays are from the previous century, so they come back as corsetry in the 19th century. Something like this we pulled, we just thought it was so gorgeous, but this is more for artifice than it is for actual waist control. But even this is a boned stomacher. So you really do see an emphasis on controlling the silhouette during this time period, because you would already be wearing a corset on top of this, but then you'd put this on and it would create an even tighter pull over your garment. So I wanted to show that. Here we have a really great example of cartridge pleating, but another thing that really makes this dress special is how much there is going on beneath the surface. While we were dressing this, we discovered two pockets. One is a watch fob pocket right here, and then the other is a full deep pocket right at the side of the dress in here. So we shouldn't also think about these things as not being connected to like the way that a woman lived her daily life. It's just that these garments might not have allowed her to live a life outside of looking at her watch and keeping something in her pocket. We don't really see a lot of utilitarian design put into these garments, but most people wearing high dress in this time period, women, are not performing utilitarian labor. So dresses don't really reflect that. However, comparing the fullness of a garment like this to the simplicity, relatively, of a garment like that, you really can see how things get a lot more complicated from the 1850s to the 1870s, whereas the 1850s is focused fully on volume and controlling and expanding it. By the 1870s, because volume has shifted to the back, it becomes more about complication and construction. So you have a complicated bodice, you have a complex skirt, you have all of this single tone, but here you have a damask silk matched with this satin over here. Construction really becomes very complicated later on in the century because the garments are not so much about volume, they're more about detail on a smaller frame. So I wanted to show that between the two. Yes?
Another question in terms of maybe economics that changing in the 19th century. These require you to be able to have people help you dress rather than dress yourself.
Right. And so this is another thing to think about, how these things are achieved. Certainly something like this is doable on your own, but it really is not something you can do by yourself. Dressing with others is not only something that just the upper class could do if they had staff to help them. I think we have to think about dressing in the 19th century as actually a very social experience because you need other people to help you get all of this ready. You can't fasten it by yourself. I mean, there are examples of things where you can. There were developments in bustles and corsetry where you can self-tie from the front, or the Busk corset was very big because you could tighten it in the back and then hook it across the front. But really, these things do require a lot of help. Towards the end of the century, as we see athleticism and mobility socially become really popular, it changes dress because now women want to be biking and golfing and playing tennis. And one, just these garments are not made for that. Two, to get ready to do that, you become aware that there's a problem. You know, if I'm supposed to go running, I can't, like, it's hard to say that attitude makes these things change. More so, it's like, people are still getting help to dress into the early 1900s. What really divorces that is the shift away from corsetry. But even by the end of the 1890s, women can't really... The shirtwaist is what really makes things possible, because the shirtwaist is the first time really where you can create an ensemble with the right, you know, bum pad. This, for example, is an Edwardian bustle. It's a spring. It's just a spring. Springs covered in this crocheted packet. But by the late 1890s, if you're not trying to dress in high fashion, you just want to get ready to go out. So it's a petticoat, it's this, it's your shirtwaist, and you're ready to go. So that's how we begin to see complications in dressing ease away, because in this bifurcation of garments, this moving away from having to have a full ensemble, it allows you to like mix your wardrobe a bit more, and by mixing your wardrobe, you're not getting as complicated all the time. But it's really up until the mid-1900s, because it's not until really about 1907 that we begin to see designers like Paul Poiret and Yannet, like they're already working in Paris, but they begin creating things that start to stabilizing these silhouettes. But it's not until that becomes normal everywhere that we really see women get away from getting help with dressing one another. Yeah, unfortunately. I mean, but it's something fascinating to think about socially. It requires a lot more work to make yourself presentable than it does today. Yeah. Are there any other questions?
You know, in a sense, what you brought up points out urban elite versus urban not so elite and rural. And for all practical purposes, the fashion industry is focused on those that can afford the exotic.
Yes.
Just like, you know, the Saturday Wall Street Journal fashion
Yes.
booklet.
Yes.
You know, I look at this picture of something that some fellow is trying to sell a shirt like this or a coat like this for $1,500, and I can buy it from LLB for $60.
Right.
So, you know, it is a really limited population that really is looking at this. And if you go to rural America,
Right. Well, I also want to expand on that. We have a great collection here, but it's not rural clothing, and there's a reason for that. It's not because of value, that we don't value the clothing and learning from it. It's because that clothing doesn't survive. It gets worn out, right? And so the study of dress is an interesting study because it's always going to be, for certain time periods, the study of a certain class's dress. But in terms of the way that class works, if you're at the top of a standard, people beneath that standard emulate you. So we can use the dress of a certain elite to infer certain things about dress lower down. But especially in Vermont, I think it's very easy to really understand that for hundreds of years there have been people working on farms who don't care two whits about a bustle. And so they wouldn't buy it. The thing about the 19th century that really is so different, though, is what you just hit on, the idea of marketing and different levels of the market. Because of the development of ready-made stores and aggregating of commerce and product into these locations, you begin to see a spectrum of who buys what and at what level. And that's true for all products, but especially for clothing, especially in a period where people are making their own clothing. You know, you're buying cheap silk or good silk, but you're still going to make a silk dress. And so that's kind of where we can look at dress from the upper class and reverse engineer for other people who aren't buying at the same level, but we're still following the same trends. But yeah, I don't think that's any different than how we do things today, especially today, where we have brands like H&M and Uniqlo and Zara. And even though those seem so commonplace to us now, fast shopping like that didn't really exist until the mid-70s, when you could go get a boutique, go to Paraphernalia and buy a dress for the disco. And so that seems very common, but it's relatively recent, in the same way that going to a department store and buying trimming for your dress was brand new in the 1840s. Prior to that, you were making it yourself or buying it or reusing grandma's chintz or something like that. So we see in the 19th century more access to products, but more access also means a diversification of class and economy and how people look across that divide. Yeah.
We have several chairs. Let's call them gentleman's chair versus a lady's chair. And the lady's chair is so damn low, I can't get out of it.
But you understand why, right?
No, that's the point I was going to make.
So this is...
The gentleman's chair is just proper.
And it's exactly during the 19th century that we see pieces of furniture like this develop, ladies' chairs, men's chairs. And it's easier to first say that that's a sexist thing, and that's why they did it, that they were gender biased. It's really because it's easier for a man to sit in pants in a higher chair than it is for a woman who needs a stool just to squat. You know, you can think of those beautiful Victorian ladies' chairs. What lady in this can really sit in that? But also look at architecture. You see Second Empire architecture with these wide windows, big hallways. It's because people need to move through them. One of the things that's very fascinating about the 19th century is that aesthetic developments in architecture and art are mirrored in fashion. Not always, but you can really generally read how, you know, you can look at a garment, you can look at a building, you can see how people fit inside that space because of the proportion of the space to accommodate the garments. Like I said, because menswear doesn't really change, it's women's wear that we have to look at. Menswear does change subtly, but it's women's wear that really is morphing throughout the century, and it's the same kind of morphology that we see in architecture and art. Yeah.
Sam, thank you for such
Thank you very much.
incredible presentation.
Thank you.